The name of Al Capone was once feared by criminals and law-abiding citizens alike. Implicated in over 100 deaths, he was famous for his ruthless control of the Chicago mob in the 1920s. But although he evaded his rivals and numerous attempts on his life, he couldn't escape the taxman, and his reign came to an end when he was incarcerated in 1931. After 7 years of surprisingly good behaviour in prison, he became violent and delusional, believing he was on a mission from God to solve the problems of the Great Depression, and he was diagnosed with an illness that led to him being described as a middle-grade moron. Welcome to Insane History. I'm Professor Graham Yorston, and today I'm exploring the colourful life of the brutal gangster who was once declared public enemy number one, but who ended his days needing round-the-clock care and died at the early age of 48. I want to find out what made Al Capone the man he was in his prime, and also what reduced his mind to that of a 7-year-old child. Alphonse Gabriel Capone, also known by his nickname of Scarface, was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1899, the fourth-born son of the 9 children of Italian immigrants, Gabriele and Teresa Capone. His father was a barber and his mother a seamstress, both originally from Angri, a small town just a few miles from the ruins of Pompeii, in one of the most beautiful parts of Italy, the Bay of Naples. His parents moved to the US in 1893, but had little money and lived in a cramped tenement building in the slightly less beautiful Navy Yard district of Brooklyn. Capone showed promise at school, hitting solid B's until he was in the 6th grade, after which he skipped most days to devote himself to learning different skills on the streets. His schooling finally came to an end at the age of 14, when he left after being punished for hitting a female teacher in the face. But he chose to walk out and was not expelled, as many accounts suggest. Like most other teenage boys of the time, he joined a gang, the South Brooklyn Rippers Kids Gang, which was involved with low-level antisocial behaviour and petty crime. But he didn't stand out in any way. He also tried his hand at a variety of honest jobs around Brooklyn, working in a candy store, a bowling alley, an ammunition factory, and a paper box factory. On payday, he would dutifully hand over his earnings to his mother. But he gradually drifted towards the more serious Junior 40 Thieves gang, and at around 15 he made the move to an adult gang, the powerful 5 Points gang based in Lower Manhattan, where he learned how to use a knife and firearms. He was big for his age, and in 1917 he got a job at the Harvard Inn in Coney Island, a saloon-stroke-brothel run by Italian-born racketeer Frankie Yale, who took it upon himself to mentor the young Capone in how the world worked. The bar was a tough place, where fights were routine and could often lead to killings. One night he was flirting with a customer's sister and commented on her anatomy. Her brother, Frank Galluccio, launched himself at Capone and carved his face and neck 3 times with a knife. Normally, such an attack would have to be avenged, but the story goes that his boss convinced Capone that he had violated an unwritten rule in disrespecting a crime family member, and that he should let it go. It is said that his restraint on this occasion demonstrated that Capone was smart and able to recognise when it was right to use force and when not. At least that's the version that Galluccio himself told, but there are doubts as to the truth of this, as there is a newspaper article suggesting that the event occurred later and at a completely different location. Whatever the details, it was these wounds that earned him the tag of Scarface. Capone himself hated the nickname and claimed the injuries were war wounds, even though he was never in the military. Afterwards, he would use talcum powder to hide the scars, and whenever he was photographed, he would try to hide the left side of his face. Newspapers, on the other hand, often retouched photographs and enhanced the scars in order to make him look more menacing. When he wasn't learning how to be a hoodlum, he spent his time in more conventional pursuits, going to church and watching baseball. He started playing with his older brother Ralph in 1916, and 2 years later, demonstrating an early talent for leadership, he formed his own semi-professional team, the Al Capone stars. As a young man, Capone was known for his intelligence and charisma. He had a knack for making friends and influencing people, skills that would serve him well in his criminal career. He also exhibited the less charming personality traits of having a quick temper, being deceitful and manipulative, and having a lack of remorse for his actions, all factors commonly associated with antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy. It was around this time that he picked up the infection that would eat away at his brain and shorten his life: syphilis. He later recalled that he had a genital sore followed by a rash on his hands and feet before he got married, but he never sought treatment and it went away by itself. This is typical of the early stages of the condition. It does often appear to go away, but in a proportion of cases the bacteria go deep into the internal organs and brain to slowly but relentlessly do their damage. Treatment was available at this time, but it was painful and expensive. However, not getting treated was risky to himself, his partners, and to any children he fathered. At the age of 18, he met May Coughlin at a dance. From an Irish immigrant background, she was 2 years older and working as a sales clerk at the same factory as Al. At this time, the Irish and Italian communities didn't normally mix, but both families seemed to approve of the relationship, and they were married at St. Mary's Star of the Sea Cathedral in Brooklyn in December 1918, 3 weeks after she had given birth to their son, Sonny. Although they had a close relationship, and May always remained loyal, Capone had frequent dalliances with sex workers at the various establishments he worked at, and it is possible that he passed his infection on to his wife, who in turn passed it on to their unborn child. As a baby, Sonny was prone to infections and developed mastoiditis, which eventually left him deaf in one ear, which may have been the result of congenital syphilis. May suffered several miscarriages and stillbirths, possibly as a result of the disease, and they were not able to have any further children. After the wedding, he tried to live a respectable life, quitting his job with Yale and moving to Baltimore to avoid the temptations of Brooklyn, where he took a legitimate job as a bookkeeper at a construction firm. Or did he? A number of sources refer to this period of honest work, but I wasn't able to track down any hard facts about it, and others have suggested that it didn't happen at all, and it is simply one of the Al Capone myths. So what, you may think? It didn't last anyway, so why does it matter? But it is quite important from a mental health perspective. If Capone had made a conscious effort to turn his back on his criminal lifestyle, get a proper job, and live within the law to support his wife and son, then it would suggest that he was beginning to mature out of the antisocial behaviours that he had showed up until that point. Sometime around 1919, he made the move to Chicago, initially working in a fairly lowly position as a bouncer in one of the sleazy bars of Big Jim Colosimo. Prohibition came into effect in January 1920, but for some reason, Colosimo didn't want to get into bootlegging. His partner, Johnny Torrio, sensed a missed opportunity, and Colosimo was mysteriously murdered. No one was ever charged, but Capone and Frankie Yale were suspects. The outcome was that Torrio took over his patch, promoted Capone to be his main enforcer, and together they expanded the business, raking in huge profits from selling illegal booze. In 1923, Capone was able to buy a substantial house on Chicago's South Side with his share of the cash. He tried hard to keep his business and family life separate, following Torrio's advice to keep your hands clean and use others to do your dirty work. And there was a lot of dirty work. Chicago had two main gangs, Torrio and Capone's South Side outfit, and the North Side gang run by Dean O'Banion. Although Torrio generally tried to keep the peace between rival gangs, tensions were always high, and when O'Banion was gunned down in 1924, it sparked an all-out turf war that went on for years. 2 months later, an attempt on Capone's life left him unharmed but unnerved, prompting him to order his famous bulletproof car. 2 weeks later, Torrio was wounded in an attempt on his life and was lucky to survive. It was a close enough shave to persuade him that it was time to get out, and he left for retirement in Italy, handing over the entire criminal operation to Capone. It is estimated that the enterprise was grossing over $1 billion in today's money, from bootleg liquor, gambling and prostitution. Quite an empire for a 26-year-old. Now in charge, Capone expanded operations to encompass illegal breweries, transportation and legitimate businesses. The extra cash allowed him to buy political and law enforcement protection, which in turn allowed him to use more violence to increase revenue. Any establishment that refused to buy alcohol from Capone would be blown up, and it is estimated that as many as 100 people, perhaps more, were killed in these bombings, in addition to all of the other killings he was implicated in. Whilst the feud with the Northside Gang was still going on, Capone ended up in an equally bloody feud with Joe Aiello, who unsuccessfully hired a string of hitmen to take him out, even attempting to poison him with a dose of cyanide at a restaurant. But through a mixture of intimidation, bribery and good luck, Capone was able to stay one step ahead and avoid being mown down by his opponents. Despite the violence, Capone was a popular figure, a working-class hero, even being seen as a Robin Hood character, taking money from the rich to help the poor. He was cheered at baseball games and always had a wisecrack for reporters, claiming that he was just giving the public what they wanted. But although he portrayed an outward persona of swagger and self-confidence, driving flashy cars, wearing fancy suits and sporting fat cigars and expensive jewellery, inwardly he was finding the constant need to be on his guard a strain. In 1928 he bought a luxury walled mansion in Palm Island, Florida, and started talking about wanting to distance himself from Chicago's violence. In January 1929 he caught flu, which developed into double pneumonia, keeping him in Florida for several weeks. But back in Chicago, Bugs Moran, leader of the Northside Gang, was about to be given a St. Valentine's Day greeting to remember. On the 14th of November 1929, Capone's men, posing as police, carried out a fake raid on a Moran business. Falling for the ploy, 7 of Moran's men lined up against a wall expecting to be frisked, only to be gunned down in cold blood. Moran was not among them. Gruesome pictures of the massacre shocked a public starting to grow tired of the bloodshed, and it damaged Capone's reputation that no amount of charity donations and soup kitchens could repair. A few weeks later, Capone was summoned to court to answer federal prohibition violations. He claimed he was ill and unable to attend court, and the hearing was delayed. But although he was still getting over pneumonia, he was well enough to go to the races and have a little trip to the Bahamas, which led to him being arrested by the FBI for contempt. Also in 1929 was the killing of 3 of his men, who had been encouraged by Aiello to oust Capone and take over the outfit. In the film version of this event, Capone himself personally carries out the hits, famously resurrecting his old baseball skills to do so. But this would have been unusual, as he generally did his best to make sure he could not be directly implicated in any violence, and historians are divided as to how true it is. Immediately afterwards, he attended a conference of organised crime leaders in Atlantic City, called to discuss how best to calm down the bootleg wars in New York and Chicago, and how to avoid them in the future, and it was attended by pretty much everybody. Capone had been booked into the exclusive Breakers Hotel on the boardwalk, which was then restricted to white Anglo-Saxon Protestant clients, and when lots of Italians tried to check in with WASP aliases, the hotel refused to let them in. Capone had a heated argument with Nucky Johnson over the arrangements, and fearing that they would come to blows and the police get called, they were bundled into a limousine and moved to a different hotel. But Capone was not for calming down, and he ripped paintings and photos off the walls and threw them at Johnson. There was a lot of discussion about the St. Valentine's Day massacre, and it has been suggested that Capone agreed to have himself arrested on a minor charge and get sent to prison for a short period of time to deflect the media and law enforcement for the good of the whole underworld. So when the conference finished, Capone and his bodyguard went to Philadelphia, where they were arrested and charged with carrying a concealed weapon. The trial was the next day. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to a year's imprisonment. This came as quite a shock. Generally, people got a fine, or at most 90 days, so a year was harsh. And 16 hours from arrest to jail? Nothing unusual in that. Did he engineer the whole thing? Like so many other key events in Al Capone's life, it is impossible to know the real truth. Did he really take one for the team? It seems unlikely, but who knows? Maybe he did. After one night in Moyamensing, he was sent to Holmesburg, one of the toughest prisons in America to do time. Nicknamed Terror Dome, it was a place where unethical medical experiments were carried out on prisoners. If the whole thing had been planned, he was having second thoughts now, and he made a series of appeals, all of which were rejected. 3 months later, however, after pulling a few strings, he was transferred to the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, which had a far less grueling regime. The warden allowed him a few home comforts and frequent visitors, and he was even permitted to pay other inmates to run errands for him. Importantly, there were no signs of mental illness or confusion. He had some minor surgery on his nose and had his tonsils out, but nothing to suggest active neurosyphilis. A doctor commented that he had never seen a prisoner so cheery, so kind, and so unassuming, and that he does his work faithfully and correctly. He even retained his sense of humour, suggesting his lawyer issue a statement denying responsibility for the Wall Street crash, a reference to him being blamed for every crime and minor catastrophe that occurred anywhere in the country. He was also keen to publicise his good deeds, such as sending Christmas baskets to the families of his fellow inmates. He was released 2 months early for good behaviour, with crowds waiting outside, but he was welcomed back to Chicago by being named Public Enemy Number 1. Encouraged by the Chicago Daily News publisher, newly elected President Herbert Hoover agreed to focus federal agencies on catching Capone and getting charges to stick. A special squad of incorruptible officers was set up, including Eliot Ness. The Untouchables, and efforts to scrutinize his tax affairs were redoubled. Despite the heat being applied to him, Capone was still able to show his muscle, and after more scheming by Aiello, Capone decided to eliminate him, completing the task in October 1930. Every time he went to Miami, he was hounded with police raids and arrests for vagrancy, perjury, and contempt of court charges. He complained of being arrested 8 times in one day. But the searches found nothing, and most of the charges were dismissed. But in June 1931, he was charged with 22 counts of income tax evasion and numerous prohibition law violations. The trial began on the 6th of October and focused on his extravagant spending versus his very modest declared income. Capone's hope of buying the jury was thwarted by it being changed at the last minute, and his defence team was weak. After 11 days, he was found guilty and sentenced to 11 years in prison, huge fines, back taxes plus interest, and court costs, the harshest sentence ever given out for tax evasion. His lawyers appealed the decision and requested he be freed on bail pending the appeal, but this was denied and he was sent to Cook County Jail and his assets frozen. The warden assigned him a private cell with shower and access to a telephone. Political friends were allowed to visit, as were gang members and the high and mighty from the underworld such as Lucky Luciano. When word got out about his lenient treatment, the warden came under pressure to toughen up, and in December 1931 he was placed in the hospital ward under 24-hour guard, and his visitors limited to immediate family and lawyers only. While there, he had a Wassermann test for syphilis, and when this came back positive, he was given anti-luetic injections, from lues maligna, an old-fashioned term for syphilis. In May 1932, the 33-year-old Capone was transferred by train to begin his sentence at Atlanta U.S. Penitentiary, considered one of the toughest federal prisons at the time. He was heavily guarded. Even Eliot Ness came along to make sure there was no escape attempt, but he was cheered all the way by well-wishers. His admission medical revealed his scars, a pendulous abdomen, but not much else, and importantly his IQ was measured at 95, very close to the average of 100. His neuropsychiatric assessment revealed his previous treatment for syphilis and a complete disregard for the truth in the personal history he gave. I particularly like his description of his previous occupation as real estate operator. You could argue that this was syphilis beginning to affect his brain, but I think he was just having a laugh. Prison officers noticed that he acted strangely at times and expressed grandiose ideas that he was the saviour of the Chicago poor and had only done what City Hall had failed to do. He didn't cause any problems, however, and he was assigned a job making overalls, which he performed well enough. Predictably, he got a lot of attention from inmates wanting to show how tough they were, and his cellmate Red Rudensky, a safecracker who had done some work for the outfit in the past, became his protector. Over time, he gradually persuaded the prison to grant him some privileges: a mirror, a typewriter, rugs on the floor, and a set of encyclopedias. But again, word got out that he was receiving special treatment, so a decision was made to transfer him to the newly opened Alcatraz in 1934, where he would effectively be isolated from the world and unable to buy influence. Located on a small island in San Francisco Bay, often shrouded in fog, Alcatraz was designed to hold the most troublesome prisoners in America. It may be a popular tourist site today, but it was no holiday destination in 1934, being compared to Devil's Island, the notorious French prison that housed Papillon. On arrival, a physician discovered that Capone had a perforated naval septum, and most historians have concluded that he must have had a cocaine habit. But in the 1930s, the commonest cause for this was syphilis, and there is no evidence that Capone was a regular user of any drugs. He didn't even like whiskey that much, preferring beer. Generally, he tried to behave and keep out of trouble, and he and some other inmates were allowed to form a band. Capone loved music, everything from jazz to opera, and although he had never played an instrument before, he got himself a banjo and a mandolin and had a go. The warden allowed them only 20 minutes a day to practice, however, so progress was slow. That he was able to make any progress at all shows that his illness was still largely in a latent phase. He even managed to write a Neapolitan love song for his loyal wife.
His Madonna Mia.
In 1935, a fellow band member hit him with his saxophone when Capone complained he was blowing it too loud near his ears. And the following year he was stabbed in the back with a pair of scissors when he was working in the laundry. But he suffered only minor wounds. In February 1938, Capone's illness took a turn for the worse. He became disoriented on his way to breakfast and didn't know where he was or what he was doing. He was violently sick and then had a seizure. He was taken to the prison hospital, where the medical staff diagnosed him with general paralysis of the insane, one of the ways in which untreated syphilis can affect people. The newspapers reported that he was violent, attacking other prisoners, kicking and spitting at them, compulsively making and remaking his bunk, and bursting into Italian operatic arias, and was either in a straitjacket or a coma, most of which was untrue. His wife was beside herself and made the 3,000-mile trip to see him. In the prison hospital he was treated with intravenous trypanosamide, iodides and intramuscular bismuth, but he refused a spinal tap and malaria therapy. After several days of confusion and restlessness, his condition improved, but he continued to experience psychotic symptoms with grandiose delusions and hallucinations. In June, he was described by his doctor in these terms: "He is definitely expansive in mood and has developed extensive plans as to his activities after his release. He is going extensively into charity work and will build factories and industries, etc., to furnish employment to everyone needing it. He takes a great deal of pleasure in perfecting these plans and relating them. His mood is happy, and he has no enemies whom he cannot excuse readily for their mistaken views, etc. He still has some disturbances of consciousness at times, as his mind wanders, and he hears God and the angels verbally reply to his prayers, etc. He, however, retains partial insight into these, and says that he probably enjoys some of the things he hears. His experiences are pleasant, and he enjoys them and feels friendly towards those about him, although he is very unstable and easily aroused by any excitement or confusion taking place on the ward. Capone remained in the hospital for the next year. He wrote frequently to his wife, his mother, and his son, but his grammar is increasingly broken. May visited each month, and whenever reporters hounded her to comment on his health, she would say, "He is going to get well. He is suffering from dejection and a broken spirit, aggravated by intense nervousness." She never discussed the real reason for his illness. In early 1939, Capone was transferred to the Federal Correctional Institute at Terminal Island in Los Angeles, and initially he coped well with the move. But in September, his condition deteriorated again. He was hearing things and assaulted other inmates and staff, and he had to be restrained to prevent him harming himself. It was around this time that he had an assessment of his cognitive functioning that placed him in the middle-grade moron category. Although deeply offensive today, this terminology was used extensively and unapologetically for decades, after being coined by psychologist Henry H. Goddard in 1910, who translated and popularized the French Binet-Simon tests. Moron, from the ancient Greek word moros meaning dull, was used to describe a person with a mental age in adulthood of between 7 and 10. The Binet-Simon test was the first standardized method of measuring intelligence, developed in 1905 by French psychologists Alfred Binet and Théodore Simon. It included items to measure the ability to follow instructions, name objects in drawings, exercise judgment, and solve problems. It seems very primitive now, but it is the forerunner of all the tests we currently use. Capone continued to be confused and somewhat depressed, with periods of irritability. He asked to be allowed out of the hospital and onto the main wings, but was otherwise unconcerned about his mental health problems, talking happily about his plans to build factories and employ 50,000 people. And most of the time, he was the same cooperative person as always. His anti-syphilitic injections were recommenced, and he showed some signs of improvement. In November 1939, he was sent to Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania to prepare for release. 3 days later, he walked out, a free man. He had done his time, although he remained on parole for another 3 years. And how did he celebrate his freedom? By signing himself into the Union Memorial Hospital in Baltimore to begin intensive treatment for syphilis the very next day. His wife had tried to get him into the more prestigious Johns Hopkins Hospital, but concerned at the potential for bad publicity, the hospital declined to accept him. His physician, Dr. Moore, noted that he was euphoric and boisterous, with mental and physical overactivity, and that he had grandiose ideas and a marked tendency towards confabulation. His cognitive functioning had dropped further to a mental age of only 7 using the Binet-Simon IQ test. Nowadays, we don't report the results of cognitive testing for adults in terms of mental age, but it does give an indication of just how seriously affected he was at this time. His doctor was rather scornful of the previous attempts that had been made to treat his syphilis and immediately began malaria therapy. It seems hard to believe now that deliberately infecting people with malaria could ever have been considered a good thing to do. But in the era before antibiotics, when syphilis was a major killer and cause of immense suffering, accounting for up to a quarter of admissions to asylums, desperate measures were needed. In 1917, the Austrian physician Julius Wagner-Jauregg used repeated cycles of malaria-induced fever paroxysms, lasting for approximately 6 hours each, over 2 days, followed by quinine injections to kill off the malaria parasites. This was regarded as such an important breakthrough that Wagner-Jauregg was awarded the Nobel Prize for his discovery in 1927, and most psychiatric hospitals around the world introduced the treatment. Capone was given 12 paroxysms of malaria and had over 120 hours of fever above the temperature of 101 degrees Fahrenheit or 38.3 degrees Celsius. After that, he was treated with bismuth salts and tryptophan. Bismuth salts were introduced in the 1880s and were less toxic than mercury, but not particularly effective. The first truly effective treatment for syphilis was salvarsan, an arsenic compound that became available in 1910. The problem was that salvarsan was extremely toxic and had to be given by painful injections, so many patients did not complete the course of treatment. To make matters worse, it did not cross the blood-brain barrier very well, so was not particularly effective in cases of advanced syphilis like Capone's, in which the syphilis bacteria were in the brain. Trypanosamide was introduced in the 1920s, another arsenic compound that was originally developed for the treatment of African sleeping sickness or trypanosomiasis, but found to be better tolerated than salvarsan, which caused severe nausea and vomiting, and to be particularly beneficial in cases of neurosyphilis, as it was able to get into the brain and spinal cord. And as the side effects were not nearly as bad, headaches, blurred vision, and seeing streaks of light, more patients completed their treatments. After 6 weeks in a 2-room suite at the hospital, attended to by the medical and nursing staff and his entire entourage of family members, food tasters, bodyguards, and a barber, he was discharged to continue his treatment as an outpatient. After 4 months, he was able to return to Florida. He was much calmer, the grandiosity and confabulation was gone, and on the Binet-Simon test, his performance increased to 14 years 6 months, almost back to normal. But he was still regarded as silly and childish in behaviour. Capone and his family were grateful for the care he received and donated 2 cherry trees to the hospital, one of which still blossoms there each spring. The following year he was reviewed by Dr. Moore, who noted that he had gained 45 pounds in weight, his cognitive functioning had deteriorated, and he was increasingly irritable towards family and strangers. In a wonderfully humane and caring letter to his doctor in Florida, he advises that no further improvements were likely with additional treatment. But, understanding that Mrs. Capone was desperate for a cure and wanting further medical opinions, he advises that these should be sought from genuine experts in the field. He also advises that to prevent Capone being aggressive to members of the public, he should be accompanied by at least 2 men all the time. He recommends that it would be beneficial for him to be kept busy and suggests his patient could take up gardening with the assistance of a live-in male nurse to help direct him in this and other activities. May looked after him devotedly and unceasingly, but allowed few photographs. Almost all of the millions he had amassed in the 1920s had been spent on lawyers, bribes, and medical costs. But the outfit, still very much going strong, gave him an allowance of $600 a week. He was prone to talking too much, often to people who weren't there, and there was a degree of nervousness that he might say something compromising. As a result, May kept him largely at home and away from public attention. At some point he received penicillin. This became available in selected cases from 1942, but most went to military hospitals. It would have finally killed off any remaining syphilis bacteria, but the damage they had been doing over 30 years could not be reversed. His speech, coordination, and ability to walk was affected, and some accounts suggest he was severely demented and incontinent. Others have said that he deliberately laid it on thick when people were around, and that he was quite happy living out his retirement with his family around him. The idea of him fishing in his pool is a myth. On the 21st of January 1947, he had a series of convulsions and was partially paralysed. He regained consciousness but was restless and distressed and developed pneumonia. He rallied briefly with oxygen and briefly recognised the people around him, but he gradually drifted off. He was 48. He was laid to rest in Chicago's Mount Olivet Cemetery and later moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery. When I started reading about Al Capone, his Brooklyn childhood, his chilling criminal career, and his slow decline, I thought it would be easy to decide whether he had a personality disorder or not. But I'm not sure. People have speculated that he may have had an antisocial personality disorder, given his propensity for violence, lack of remorse, short temper and impulsivity. Others have suggested narcissistic personality disorder, with a grandiose sense of self-importance, lack of empathy, and a need for admiration. Both are possible, But what struck me most is how difficult it is to pin down any facts about Al Capone's life. New biographies bring new information and new interpretations, but many of these conflict with what has gone before. And so much of his life history is based on the testimony of other gangland figures, who, forgive me for being sceptical, may not be the most reliable of historians. What is clear is that despite his ruthlessness in pursuing his business interests, he had a softer side. He was a caring son, a loving husband and doting father who loved watching sport and listening to music. For some, he is a working-class hero who did what he had to do. For others, he was an evil monster who used people and murdered without a second thought. My own thoughts are that whilst I have no doubt he could be charming and witty and great company, I wouldn't have wanted to get on the wrong side of him. But regardless of whether you see him as a callous killer or simply a product of his environment, there is no doubt that the once powerful crime lord was brought low by a tiny bacterium. Going from mobster to... no, I'm not going to use that word again. Cognitive impairment. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to find out more about Al Capone, then there are plenty of movies, of course, but I'd highly recommend this book, Mr. Capone by Robert Schoenberg. And it is a very compassionate book. It humanises Capone. It doesn't shy away from the brutality of his life, but it makes him more of a human being than Hollywood biopics are ever likely to do. I put this on my Amazon store page along with some of the better movies. I'd also recommend the My Al Capone Museum website, which is full of fascinating bits of information and photographs unavailable elsewhere. Please let me know if there are any other criminals with mental health issues you'd like me to cover. There should be plenty of these to choose from. And remember to subscribe and click for notifications to be kept up to date with the latest releases. And I hope to see you again soon. Cheerio for now. Goodbye.